For most of my life, I believed people kept leaving me because they were selfish, ungrateful, or too weak to handle the truth. My name is Arthur Bennett. I am 82 years old, and it took me nearly 8 decades to understand that the difficult one, the one I had been complaining about all those years, was me. That is not an easy sentence for an old man to say. It sits in the mouth like something bitter, and even now, after all the apologizing I have done, and all the quiet thinking I have forced myself to do, part of me still wants to soften it. I want to say I was misunderstood, or that I had good reasons, or that I only became hard because life required it. Some of that may even be true. But a reason is not the same as an excuse, and age has a way of stripping language down until you cannot hide inside it anymore. I was not a cruel man in the way people usually mean. I did not hit my children. I did not drink away the rent. I worked hard, paid the mortgage, kept the lawn neat, remembered oil changes, showed up early, and believed that responsibility was the highest form of love. If you had asked me at 60 whether I had been a good husband and father, I would have said yes, not proudly exactly, but with the confidence of a man who had receipts. I had provided. I had stayed. I had not run off, not wasted money, not made a fool of my family. I thought that should count for more than it did. The trouble was, I counted what I gave and ignored what I took. I was born in 1944 in a mill town in northern Pennsylvania, the second of 3 boys and the quietest, until I learned that quiet boys get stepped over. My father was a hard man, though I did not have that language for him then. Back then, we called hard men strong men, and if they frightened their children, people said they were raising them right. He believed praise made boys soft and mistakes needed to be corrected before they became habits. My mother moved around him like a woman carrying a bowl filled to the rim, careful not to spill a feeling he might not approve of. I learned early that being wrong was dangerous. If I spilled milk, I was careless. If I forgot a chore, I was lazy. If I cried, I was trying to get attention. So I became sharp. I watched faces. I listened for changes in tone. I found small mistakes in other people before they could find mine. A boy who can point first may avoid being pointed at, and by the time I was grown, that habit felt so natural, I mistook it for intelligence. I met my wife, Helen, when I was 22 and working at a parts warehouse. She had dark hair then, thick and wavy, and a laugh that came quickly, like she had been waiting all day for someone to give her permission. She worked at the front desk of a dental office, and the first time I saw her was at a church picnic, balancing a paper plate in one hand and helping a little girl tie her shoe with the other. I remember thinking she had a softness I did not understand, and instead of being drawn to it kindly, I wanted to stand near it and warm myself. Helen liked me because I was steady. That is what she told me later. She said I seemed like a man who knew what he wanted and would not be blown off course. I took that as a compliment, and for many years I used it as proof that she had chosen me with open eyes. But there is a difference between being steady and being immovable. A tree is steady. A wall is immovable. I spent too much of my life being a wall and calling it strength. We married in 1968. Our first apartment was above a bakery, and every morning the smell of bread came through the floorboards before dawn. We had second-hand furniture, thin curtains, one good frying pan, and a radio that needed a folded matchbook under one corner to work properly. Helen would dance in that little kitchen while coffee perked, barefoot on the worn linoleum, and I would tell her to be careful because the floor was uneven. That was me even then. She was dancing, and I was inspecting the floor. Our son, David, was born 2 years later, and our daughter Anne came 3 years after that. I love them. I want that understood, though I know love that cannot be felt by the people receiving it has failed in some important way. I loved them in the way I knew how, which meant I worried over them, corrected them, tried to prepare them for a world I believed would punish weakness. I thought tenderness was something mothers gave and fathers balanced with truth. I did not know that truth without tenderness often becomes only another kind of injury. When David was small, he was clumsy in a sweet, harmless way. He bumped into tables, dropped toys, and forgot where he put his shoes. I would say, "Pay attention, son," and at first it was gentle enough. But as he grew, I grew impatient. A spilled glass became a lecture. A poor grade became a character flaw. If he came home excited about something, I found the weak spot in it. If he built a model airplane, I pointed out the crooked wing. If he mowed the grass, I showed him the strips he missed. I told myself I was teaching him to do things right. What I was really teaching him was that my approval lived behind a locked door, and he had been born without the key. Anne was different. She was observant, careful, and sensitive to the mood in a room. She learned my footsteps the way I had learned my father's. If I came home quietly, she disappeared into her bedroom. If I sighed at the dinner table, she would ask if I wanted more potatoes, though she was only 9 or 10. At the time, I thought she was thoughtful. It pains me now to say I was proud of how little trouble she caused. I did not ask myself why a child had become so skilled at preventing trouble. Helen tried to tell me. Not all at once, not in some dramatic speech, but in small sentences over many years. She would say, "Arthur, let him enjoy it first." Or, "Arthur, she is only a child." Or, "You do not have to make every little thing into a lesson." I heard those sentences as criticism. And criticism, to me, was an alarm bell. My shoulders would stiffen. My voice would go flat. I would say, "So I'm the villain now?" Or, "Someone has to teach them." Or, "You want me to lie to them." I had a gift for turning every concern into an accusation against me, and then defending myself so fiercely that the original point got lost. That was one of my oldest tricks, though I did not know it was a trick. If someone told me I had hurt them, I made the conversation about how unfair it was for them to say so. If Helen said I sounded harsh, I would remind her how hard I worked. If David said I never listened, I would list the things I had paid for. If Anne said I made her nervous, I would say she was too sensitive. I thought I was answering them. I was really refusing them. As the years went on, our house became orderly and careful. Not unhappy all the time. That is the part people outside a family often misunderstand. There were good days. We had birthdays, Christmas mornings, summer trips to the lake, Sunday roasts, board games, and school concerts. I could be funny when I was relaxed. I fixed bicycles, taught David to change a tire, and drove Anne to the library every Saturday because she loved books. Helen and I would sometimes sit on the porch in the evening, and for a while, the air between us felt peaceful. A life is not one thing. That is what makes regret complicated. If I had been terrible every minute, everyone would have known what to call it. Instead, I was often decent and sometimes kind, and then, without warning, I became impossible. I carried resentment the way some men carry a wallet. Always with me, always ready to open. I resented my boss for not seeing my worth. I resented neighbors who borrowed tools and returned them late. I resented Helen's sister because she gave advice too freely. I resented my children's teachers when they corrected my children, and then resented my children when they proved the teachers right. I resented waiters, mechanics, clerks, doctors, and Danione who made me feel ignored or delayed or corrected. I called it having standards. I called it not letting people walk all over me. But standards are about what you build. Resentment is about what you keep reheating long after the meal has ended. By my late 50s, David called less often. He had moved 2 states away for work, married a kind woman named Marcy, and had 2 boys of his own. When he called, I could feel him keeping things light. Weather, work, the boys. If he mentioned a problem, I gave advice before he finished explaining. If he mentioned success, I warned him not to get complacent. After a while, he stopped bringing me anything that mattered. I told Helen he had become distant because young people were self-absorbed. Helen looked at me for a long moment and said, "Arthur, he is careful with you because he has to be." I remember the heat that rose in me. I said, "I suppose that's my fault too." She did not answer, and her silence made me angrier than any answer could have. Anne stayed closer geographically, but not emotionally. She lived 20 minutes away, worked as a nurse, and visited often after her daughter Lily was born. I loved Lily with a tenderness that surprised me. Grandchildren can find doors in a person he thought were sealed shut. When Lily was little, she would climb into my lap with a book, and I would read to her in voices that made her giggle. I was gentler with her than I had been with my own children, partly because age had softened me, and partly because grandparenting did not carry the same pressure to shape and correct. But even then, I could not leave things alone. When Lily was 6 and spilled orange juice on our tablecloth, I snapped, "Look what you've done." Her face changed. Not dramatically, just closed, like a curtain pulled quickly across a window. Anne cleaned it up without a word, and later she told me, quietly, "Please don't speak to her like that." I said, "She needs to learn to be careful." Anne said, "She is 6. I said, "And you are acting like I struck her." Anne packed Lily's things and left early. For 3 days I sat with that incident and polished my resentment until it shone. I told myself Anne was overprotective. I told myself children today were treated like glass. I told myself my own father would have done far worse, and no one would have dared object. That was another way I stayed blind. I compared myself to the worst thing I knew and declared myself good because I had done less damage. It never occurred to me that doing less harm than my father was not the same as doing no harm. Helen died when I was 72. It was a stroke on an ordinary Tuesday morning. She was standing at the kitchen counter, cutting an apple, and then she was on the floor, one hand still holding the knife. There are details of that morning I will not describe because some memories are not meant to be handed around. I will only say that when the ambulance doors closed, I was still wearing slippers, and a neighbor had to drive me to the hospital because I could not find my keys, though they were in my pocket. After she died, people were kind to me for a while. Casseroles appeared. Cards came. David stayed a week. Anne came every day. Lily, 12 by then, hugged me with that awkward tenderness children offer when they know grief is in the room, but not what shape it has. I was grateful, but gratitude was not a language I spoke well, so mostly I corrected how they helped. The lasagna was too salty. David put the trash bins in the wrong place, and canceled an appointment I had intended to reschedule myself. Lily touched Helen's sewing basket, and I told her sharply not to meddle with things she did not understand. They were mourning, too. I see that now. At the time, I acted as if Helen had belonged more to me than to anyone else, as if my loss gave me the right to be careless with theirs. When the house emptied, I became a widower in the fullest sense. Not just a man whose wife had died, but a man suddenly surrounded by the echo of everything she had softened. Helen had been the cushion between me and the world. She remembered birthdays, explained my moods, told people I meant well, laughed off my sharp remarks, nudged the children to call, nudged me to call back, and translated my worry into something that sounded like love. Without her, people received me directly, and many of them stepped away. I blamed them for that. I blamed everyone. I told myself grief had shown me who truly cared. David called every Sunday for a few months, and every other Sunday, and less predictably. Anne still visited, but she looked tired before she even sat down. Lily became a teenager and stopped wanting to come. I said, "She's too busy for her grandfather now." Anne said, "She remembers being scolded here." I said, "For heaven's sake, once over juice?" Anne's face hardened. "It was not once," she said. "Those 4 words should have opened something in me. Instead, they offended me. The first real crack in my certainty came when I was 77, though at the time I experienced it as betrayal. David came for Thanksgiving with Marcy and the boys, who were nearly grown by then. Anne came with Lily. It was the first holiday in years with everyone under my roof, and I had built it up in my mind as proof that the family was still intact. I wanted the table set the way Helen used to set it. I wanted the turkey carved properly. I wanted conversation to be cheerful but not foolish, respectful but not stiff. In other words, I wanted 7 people to move through grief, memory, appetite, fatigue, and old family tensions without disturbing the picture in my head. Of course. They failed, because people always fail impossible tests. The potatoes were late. One grandson wore a shirt I thought looked sloppy. Lily checked her phone at the table. David mentioned that he and Marcy were thinking of moving farther west, and I heard no news but abandonment. Something in me tightened. I made one comment, then another. Small corrections, little jabs disguised as humor. "Nice of you to join us between messages, Lily. I suppose people don't dress for holidays anymore. Moving again, David. Must be nice to treat family like a rest stop." The room grew quiet in stages. I could feel it happening, and still could not stop. That is something I have had to admit. There were times I knew I was making people uncomfortable, and I chose the power of continuing over the humility of stopping. David put down his fork. He did not shout. That might have been easier. He simply looked at me with a weariness I had never seen so plainly and said, "Dad, do you hear yourself?" I said, "I hear a man trying to have one decent holiday in his own house." He said, "No, you hear yourself being disappointed in everyone before anyone even has a chance." The words hit me, but I pushed back as I always did. I said he was ungrateful. I said I had never asked for much. I said after all I had done, it was remarkable how easily everyone found fault with me, and started crying quietly, which made me angrier because I felt accused by her tears. Marcy took the boys into the living room. Lily stared at her plate. The holiday collapsed, not with shouting exactly, but with the old machinery of our family grinding itself into the same shape it always had. They left early the next morning. David hugged me stiffly. Anne kissed my cheek and said she would call. Lily said goodbye from the porch steps without meeting my eyes. I stood at the door as their cars pulled away, and I remember thinking, there they go again, punishing me for telling the truth. For several weeks, I lived inside that version of the story. I told it to myself while washing dishes, while watching television, while lying awake at 3 in the morning. I was the old father, lonely and misunderstood. They were too sensitive, too modern, too quick to judge. I had given them everything, and now they wanted me to become some soft, smiling fool who never objected to anything. My resentment had a rhythm, and I walked around inside it like a man pacing a familiar room. Then Anne stopped calling for a while, not completely. She would answer if I called, but she no longer dropped by. She no longer asked if I needed groceries. She no longer offered little details about Lily or work. Her voice was polite, and politeness from your own child can feel colder than anger. I complained about it to my neighbor, Frank, a retired school principal who lived across the street. Frank was a widower too, but a different kind of widower. People visited him. His grown children came by with coffee. Neighbors leaned on his fence. Dogs liked him. I had always told myself this was because Frank was easy. And easy people never had to make hard decisions. One morning, after I had gone on for too long about my children, Frank stirred his coffee and said, "Arthur, can I ask you something without you biting my head off?" I said, "That depends on the question." He smiled a little, but did not back down. "Do you want to be right, or do you want them to come around?" I laughed because it sounded like something from a greeting card, and I had no patience for that. But Frank kept looking at me. He said, "I'm serious. Because sometimes you talk like being right should keep you company." I snapped at him, of course. I told him he did not understand my family. I told him my children had been raised well and had no reason to treat me like a burden. Frank let me finish. Then he said, "Maybe, but I've known you for 20 years, and I'll tell you something. You make it hard for people to give you anything because you inspect it before you receive it." I got up and left. I did not speak to him for 10 days. But his sentence followed me. You inspect it before you receive it. I heard it while opening the mail. I heard it while making soup. I heard it when David called and told me his youngest had gotten into college, and before I could stop myself I said, "Hope he picked something practical." There was a pause on the line. David said, "Yeah, Dad." Not angry, just tired. After we hung up, I sat in my chair and felt something unfamiliar. Not guilt exactly. Not yet. It was more like catching sight of myself in a window when I had not known I was standing there around that time. My doctor suggested I attend a grief group at the community center. I refused at first. I said I did not need to sit in a circle with strangers discussing feelings. He said loneliness worsens blood pressure and sleep, which was clever of him because medical language offended me less than emotional language. So I went, intending to be sensible and brief, and probably superior. There were 8 of us in the group, all older, all carrying different versions of absence. A woman named June had lost her husband after 56 years. A man named Robert had lost his brother. Another woman, Maria, had lost her adult son. I listened the first week with my arms crossed. People cried. People spoke softly. I judged them in small, private ways, because judging is easier than joining. Then Maria said something that began to undo me. She said, "I spent the first year after my son died being angry that people didn't know how to help me. Then one day my daughter told me, 'Mama, we try, but you punish us for doing it wrong.' I looked at her then. Really looked. She was not dramatic. She was not self-pitying. She was simply telling the truth as it had arrived to her, and I felt my face grow warm. We try, but you punish us for doing it wrong. I thought of David taking out the trash and canceling an appointment. Lily touching the sewing basket. Helen dancing in the kitchen while I warned her about the floor. I did not speak that day. But I went back the next week that the slow humiliation of self-knowledge is that it does not come all at once. At least it did not for me. I did not wake up one morning transformed. I resisted every inch. I would see one thing clearly, then spend days arguing with it. I would admit I had been harsh, then remind myself others had been careless. I would feel sorrow, then convert it into irritation, because irritation made me feel less exposed. But once the first crack opened, light kept getting in, whether I welcomed it or not. I began remembering conversations differently. That was one of the hardest parts. Memory had always served me like a loyal clerk, filing events under headings that protected me. Under disrespect, it had filed Helen asking me to lower my voice. Under ingratitude, it had filed David avoiding my advice. Under oversensitivity, it had filed Anne's tears. Under bad manners, it had filed Lily's distance. But now the labels began to peel off, and underneath them were other possibilities: fear, exhaustion, hurt, self-protection. Simple human wish to be loved without being corrected first. Found a box of Helen's things in the bedroom closet the winter I turned 78. I had avoided it after her death, telling myself I was not sentimental, but really, I was afraid of being alone with what remained. Inside were scarves, church programs, old greeting cards, and several notebooks. Helen had kept lists in them mostly, recipes, expenses, things to do. But in one notebook, tucked between a recipe for lemon cake and a list of Christmas gifts, she had written a few pages that were not meant for me, or perhaps were meant for herself when there was no one else to hear. I should say I know reading them was a trespass. I knew it then, too, and I read anyway. Grief can make thieves of us. We steal one more look, one more word, one more private piece of the person we lost. She had written about me. Not cruelly. That almost made it worse. She wrote, "Arthur is not an unkind man, but he is so defended that kindness has to fight its way out of him." I had to put the notebook down after that sentence. I walked around the bedroom, angry at her, angry at myself, angry that the dead can still tell the truth when you are no longer able to argue back. Later, I read more. She wrote that she was tired of translating me, tired of telling the children their father meant well, tired of absorbing my moods before they reached the rest of the house, tired of knowing that a good day could turn over one small mistake. She wrote, "I think he believes he is protecting us from the world, but sometimes he becomes the world we need protection from." There are sentences that divide a life into before and after. That was one. I sat on the edge of the bed with that notebook in my lap, and for the first time I did not defend myself. I did not say she was exaggerating. I did not say she should have told me, because she had told me in every way she knew. I did not say my father was worse, because my father was not on trial. I just sat there and let the words exist. Sometimes that is where repentance begins, not in tears or speeches, but in the first quiet moment when you stop interrupting the truth. After that, I did something I had never done seriously before. I made an appointment with a counselor. I nearly canceled 3 times. Sitting in the waiting room at 78, surrounded by magazines and soft lamps, I felt ridiculous, like a man arriving 50 years late to a class everyone else had finished. The counselor was a woman in her 50s, named Dr. Patel, calm but not overly gentle. I told her I was there because my family thought I was difficult. She asked, "Do you think you are?" I said, "I think they have become very sensitive." She nodded and said, "That may be true." "And do you think you are difficult?" I did not like her, but I kept going, partly because I was lonely enough to pay someone to ask me questions I resented. Over time, she helped me see the pattern I had mistaken for personality. I experienced shame as danger, so I defended against it. I experienced disagreement as disrespect, so I fought it. I experienced other people's hurt as an accusation, so I put them on trial. I thought I was having arguments about facts, but much of the time I was fighting the old terror of being found wrong and therefore unsafe. Understanding that did not erase responsibility. That was important. There is a kind of self-pity that can dress itself as insight. A man can learn why he became harmful, and then expect everyone to comfort him for it. I was tempted by that. I wanted to call David and Anne and explain my childhood, my father, the house I grew up in, the fear I had carried. I wanted them to say, "Oh, Dad, now we understand. None of it was your fault." But Dr. Patel said, "Explanations can be useful, Arthur, but be careful not to hand your children a bill for pain they did not cause." So I began with apology, though I was bad at it. My first attempts were clumsy and still full of defense. I called Anne and said, I know you think I was hard on you. She said, Dad, that is not an apology. I felt the old heat rise. I wanted to say she was impossible to please. Instead, I gripped the phone and said, You're right. Let me try again. It was one of the hardest little sentences I had ever spoken. I told her I was sorry for making her responsible for my moods when she was a child. I said I was sorry for calling her sensitive when she was telling me she was hurt. I said I was sorry for the way I spoke to Lily. I did not ask her to forgive me. I did not ask if she remembered good things too. I did not mention all I had provided. My voice shook, and I hated that, but I kept going. When I finished, Anne was quiet for so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, Thank you for saying that. Not, it's all right. Not, I forgive you. Just thank you. And for once, I understood that was something. David was harder. Not because he was harsher, but because he had gone farther away inside himself. When I called and asked if we could talk about some things I regretted, he made a sound I could not read. He said, Sure, Dad. That old polite distance. I told him I had been too critical, that I had confused preparing him with discouraging him, that I had made him feel he could not bring me his life unless it was already corrected and presentable. My throat tightened when I said, I think I taught you to expect disappointment from me, and I am sorry. David did not cry. David is like me in some ways, though I wish I had given him better parts to inherit. He said, I appreciate that. Then, after a moment, he said, I wish you had seen it sooner. There it was. The sentence I deserved and could not repair. I wish you had seen it sooner. I said, I do too. That conversation did not fix 30 years. People like quick endings, but families do not heal like that. There was no swelling music, no immediate invitation to move closer, no grandchildren rushing back into my arms. David still called carefully, and still had boundaries. Lily, by then in college, was polite but reserved. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a door people owe you because you finally found the courage to knock. Sometimes it is a path they may or may not choose to walk, and your work is to become safer, whether or not anyone rewards you for it. That may have been the most humbling part. I had to change without using change as a way to demand closeness. I had to stop keeping score of who noticed. At first, I wanted credit for every restraint. If I did not criticize, I wanted someone to praise my silence. If I listened without interrupting, I wanted a medal. It is embarrassing to admit, but old habits are greedy. They do not disappear because you name them. I began practicing in small ways. When Anne told me Lily was changing her major, I felt the advice rise in my chest like steam. I wanted to ask about job prospects, costs, and practicality. Instead, I said, How does she feel about it? Anne looked at me as if checking for a trap. Excited, she said. I said, Then I'm glad she has something that excites her. That sentence felt unnatural in my mouth, like using my left hand to write, but it was true enough, and it did no harm. Sometimes goodness begins as restraint before it becomes warmth. That when David told me his company was restructuring, I listened. Really listened. I asked what he needed, not what he should do. He said, half joking, Who are you, and what have you done with my father? I laughed, but after we hung up, I cried. Not because the joke hurt me. Because it was fair. I wrote letters too. That was easier sometimes than speaking, because paper gave me time to remove the poison before handing over the message. I wrote to Marcy, thanking her for the patience she had shown when I made visits uncomfortable. I wrote to Lily and told her I was sorry for making my house a place where she had to be careful. I told her I remembered reading to her when she was small, and that those were among the happiest memories of my later life. I said she did not need to answer. She did answer 3 weeks later with a short note. Thank you, Grandpa. I remember the voices you did for the fox and the farmer. I kept that note in my knit stand. I still read it sometimes. At 80, I sold the house. That surprised everyone, including me. For years, I had treated that house as proof. Proof I had worked hard. Proof I had built something. Proof that me family had a place to return to, even if they did not return as often as I wanted. But after Helen died, and after I began seeing clearly, the house felt less like a home and more like a museum of my stubbornness. Every room held an argument I had won and a closeness I had lost. I moved to a smaller place near Anne, not too near, because we both needed space, but near enough that dinner did not have to be an event. Before I left, I walked through the empty rooms. The dining room where Thanksgiving had fallen apart. The kitchen where Helen had danced. The hallway where the children's school pictures once hung. I stood in David's old room and remembered him at 12, showing me a drawing he had made of a car. I had pointed out that the wheels were uneven. He had folded the paper and said, "Never mind." I had forgotten that moment for 40 years. Or maybe I had filed it somewhere under minor. But standing there in the empty room, I could see his face clearly. The small closing. The retreat. A child saying never mind to his own excitement. I said aloud, "I'm sorry, son." No one heard it. But I needed to say it in the room where the boy had been. In Anne's room. I remembered her sitting on the bed, brushing a doll's hair, asking me if I was mad. I had said, "No," in a voice that meant yes. She had nodded like a little adult and gone quiet. Children believe our moods are weather they caused. I wish every parent understood that before the damage is done. A child should not have to become a meteorologist of a parent's temper. The new apartment was easier to live in. Fewer rooms, fewer ghosts. Anne helped me arrange furniture. I asked where she thought the bookcase should go, and then did not argue when she answered. That may sound small to you. In my family, it was a small miracle. We ordered Chinese food and ate from cartons at the counter. For a moment, I saw her relax in my presence, not completely, but enough. Enough to show me what I had been missing. The last few years have not made me into a saint. I still feel the old reactions. A clerk moves slowly, and irritation rises. A doctor explains something twice, and I feel insulted. David makes a choice I do not understand, and advice lines up at the back of my teeth. But now, more often than not, I notice. That noticing is the space where a different life can still be made, even at 82. I ask myself, Arthur, what are you protecting right now? Your dignity or your fear? Sometimes I answer honestly. Sometimes I fail and have to apologize again. I have learned that an apology is not a single event. It is a way of living after you have seen the truth. It is arriving at conversations with your weapons left outside. It is letting someone remember you differently than you remember yourself. It is not insisting that your good intentions erase their bad experiences. It is saying, "Tell me more," when every defended part of you wants to say, "That's not what happened." A few months ago, Lily came to visit me on her own. She is 22 now, bright and thoughtful, with Helen's quick laugh when she forgets to guard it. She brought coffee and a bag of pastries, and we sat by the window while rain tapped against the glass. For a while, we talked about her classes, her friends, and a stray cat she had started feeding near her apartment. I listened. I did not warn her about germs or expenses or getting attached. Then she said, "Mom told me you've been working hard to change." I looked at my hands. Old hands, spotted and veined, hands that had fixed things and held things and pointed too often. I said, "I should have worked hard sooner." She said, "Maybe, but I'm glad you're doing it now. There are mercies you do not deserve, but must receive cleanly when they come." I said, "Thank you, nothing more." No speech. No attempt to turn the moment into proof of my redemption. Just thank you. After she left, I sat by the window for a long time and thought about Helen. I think about her every day, but differently now. For years after she died, I missed what she gave me. Her cooking, her reminders, her presence in the bed beside me, her ability to make the house feel inhabited. Now I also grieve what I did not give her, the ease she deserved, the softness she kept offering and rarely received in return. I cannot apologize to her in the way I want to. I can only live toward the truth she left behind. I can only stop asking the living to pay for what I failed to understand while she was here, dotted 82. The past is not past in the way young people imagine. It is not behind you like a town disappearing in a rearview mirror. It is in your tone of voice, your habits, your flinches, the way your children tense when you begin a sentence. It is in the empty chair, the unanswered call, the room that gets quiet when you enter. But the past is also in the repair, if you are willing to do it without applause. It is in the second sentence, after the first one comes out wrong. It is in calling back to say, I heard myself just now, and I'm sorry. It is in letting your children be adults without treating their independence as rejection. It is in learning very late that love is not proven by how much you sacrificed if the people you sacrificed for could not breathe around you. Used to believe being difficult meant other people could not handle honesty. Now I think, for me, being difficult meant I could not handle vulnerability. I could handle bills, sickness, work, repairs, funerals, and emergencies. I could handle almost anything except the simple moment when someone I loved said, "You hurt me," and my task was not to argue, not to explain, not to win, but to stay present and care. If you are listening to me now, and you recognize someone else in this story, maybe an old father, a mother, a spouse, a friend who makes every room harder, I understand. Some people never look. Some people protect their version of the story until the very end, and you are allowed to stop standing in the path of their sharpness. But if, while listening, you felt even a small, uncomfortable tug in your own chest, do not push it away too quickly. That tug may be the beginning of freedom. Not the easy kind. The kind that first feels like shame, and then if you let it do its work, becomes responsibility. I will not tell you it is never too late, because sometimes it is too late for certain things. It is too late for me to give Helen the husband she should have had when she was 40. It is too late to read bedtime stories to David without correcting him the next morning. It is too late to make Anne's childhood feel safe from the beginning. Some doors close, and pretending otherwise is just another way of refusing grief. But it may not be too late for the next conversation. It may not be too late to become easier to tell the truth to. It may not be too late to put down the old resentment you have been calling wisdom. It may not be too late to ask one honest question and survive the answer. I spent 30 years believing I was surrounded by difficult people. A wife who criticized, children who withdrew, relatives who disappointed, neighbors who misunderstood. Then, late in life, I turned around and saw the common thread standing there in my own shoes. That realization did not destroy me, though I feared it would. It humbled me. It emptied my hands of weapons I was too tired to keep carrying. And in that empty space, small but real, there was room for something I had wanted all along and kept driving away. There was room for love to reach me, without having to defend itself first.